Well, let's get into it this morning. We're going to talk about Matthew 25, which there's organizations that are called Matthew 25. There are sermons that you may have heard on the sheep and the goats. I want to narrow in, though, today on the recipients of Matthew 25. Those who need a drink of water, those who need clothing, those who are in prison, those who need justice, those who need our prayers, those who need our visitation. We often come to Matthew 25 and we think, okay, how can I be like the sheep and not like the goats? How can I live a life that says, that at the end Jesus will say to the nations, the sheep go to my right, the goats go to my left, and the sheep, because you gave a cup of cold water to someone who is in need, you gave it to me. Because you clothed someone who is in need, you were actually clothing me. And the people who did that will say, well, Lord, when did we see you naked? When did we see you in prison? When did we see you ill and sick and visit you? And Jesus says, when you do it to the least of these. And that phrase, least of these, applies to any context, to any culture, to any country, to any group. Whomever the social group thinks is on the bottom in that particular context, in that particular time, Jesus says, when you do those things to the group that sees everything from below, looking up, when you do that to the least of these, is his phrase, you are doing it unto me. This picture up on the screen, there's a sculptor, an artist. His name is Timothy Schmalz. He's from Canada, and this is actually a bronze sculpture, and this is called Homeless Jesus. It is in quite a few cities in the world, and there have been stories where people have come up to try to actually bring this person maybe a bag of food or something like that, or check on them to see if they're okay. And while you can't see it now, if you were to bend down as if you were someone who was on the bottom looking up and look into where the hood covering comes down, you'll see just a faint picture, a faint image of what you would think, oh, okay, that's Jesus. It's Jesus. This image, I like this image of his as well. This is called Visitation. This is an image of Mary and Elizabeth visiting one another. You know that story where they're both pregnant, one with John, one with Jesus, and they visit, and the songs just start, the redemption songs just start coming out. And we see that maybe it has this shape of song, maybe it has this shape of heart, and then I also think that it's interesting, just a little baby bump on both of them. This image is when I was hungry and thirsty. And you can see on the hand, there is a nail hole, a scar from a nail. And again, if you would lower yourself to look up, to look from below, you would see that, yes, in that hood, in that shrouded figure, is the face of Christ. He's communicating Matthew 25 with these images. We happen to have one of his sculptures. It is in the foyer where you walk in. Someday, I imagine that we will meet a mason, a bricklayer, someone who's familiar with laying brick and stone, mortar, and they will help us to cement that into the wall right there permanently, so that when we come in, we are greeted with one another, We're greeted with coffee. We're greeted with donuts. We get to see each other. But then we pass by Jesus sticking his hand out from the bars. And it says, when I was in prison. Lily, could you bring up that small image? Thank you. So I have a little miniature of it too. I keep this in my office. The large sculpture comes with the minis as well, so that you might pass these minis around, and other people would get the idea. Maybe we want this for our location or for our property or whatnot. Ours is not solid cast. That is not something that we could afford. We cannot afford a sculpture of a few hundred pounds in bronze, right? But ours was something that he did for cost. The cost to do that it's cast in resin, and then it has the metal overlay. And we asked, and he said yes. And so they just did it for the cost of materials and shipping. And we received that. When I was younger, I heard like the conventional wisdom, the stories that we heard about prison, about jail, about police, about courts, about the judicial system. That, and maybe you did too. I was told, if you don't do anything wrong, you have no reason to fear fill in the blank, the police. If you don't do anything wrong, you have no reason to fear prison. If you don't do anything wrong, you have no reason to fear jail or court or just, lawyers, or just go down. If you've not done anything wrong, then you don't have any reason to fear that system. And I have realized through the scriptures, through experience, through my friendships, through a view from the Matthew 25, a view from the below, that is not often the case. I was wrong. Or what I was told was wrong. If you don't do anything wrong, there's no reason to fear the police. I figured out that that is not the case. Lots of times in our country, in our state, in our county, and in our city, we have systems and structures that are not set up to allow someone who, say, doesn't read to participate in a fair and equitable way in court. I had an experience in May earlier this year where I was going with a friend to court with him. He was receiving an eviction notice, and it was an unjust eviction notice. Let me tell you about this. The landlord company said to my friend that you are being evicted because there are damages and it is an unclean apartment. Damages and an unclean apartment. Well, so he is drawn to court, and he's supposed to speak for himself. If we were to write something for him to say, he would not be able to read it with any sort of confidence into the microphone, into court. The expectation is that you can defend yourself. The expectation is that you can bring witnesses and play the part of lawyer in eviction court. No experience, no familiarity. It's an unjust expectation that if there are going to be consequences to you through the court system, that you know how to participate. When most of us, or many of us, we don't. So he gets to court because of these two things that the landlord and the landlord's lawyer brought up. One is the cleanliness issue. The second one is damages. All right, and they brought pictures. So the cleanliness issue is actually after a couple people helped me along the road with this. The cleanliness issue is not something that actually is provable in any sort of eviction court, because my idea of cleanliness might be different than someone else's idea of cleanliness, or how you live in your home might be different than how I live in my home, or someone across the street, or someone on the other side of town, or someone in the country, right? Someone in the country may be working in the barn, and they take their barn boots in and leave them on the porch, and the mud falls kind of off, right? How can we go around sort of with the judicial system trying to determine what's clean and what's not clean? It's not something that's provable. You can't compare. There's no basis. And in fact, I now know, that is a widely known thing in eviction court. Cleanliness doesn't count. Okay, so there's the first charge, and it doesn't count. Second one is damages. And they brought pictures. And I'll tell you that the main picture was some ceiling that had fallen down, like plaster or drywall, onto the bathroom floor. And they were saying, look at these damages. Well, we find out that there was a leak on the second floor of the house that saturated that ceiling, which then it eventually fell onto the floor. And my friend happened to be receiving medical care in the hospital when that happened, right around the same time. And so myself and some others go in to court with our friend, and we have an opportunity to speak with the other person's lawyer. And it becomes known that actually it's the responsibility of the landlord company. Because, right, it's their building. There was a water leak on the second. It has nothing to do with our friend, the tenant. So the second charge for eviction is not correct either. It was falsified. So now both of those charges are gone, right? The cleanliness issue is gone because it doesn't count in court. The damages are gone because they weren't true. But yet, the $500 attorney fee for the landlord is now attached to our friend who was going to be evicted. And the $120-some court cost, let's pretend, I can't remember, let's pretend it's $128, something like that. The $128 court cost is now also attached to our friend who they were attempting to evict. So now, based on two things that didn't happen, no representation on his part. He's represented himself. He doesn't. The system isn't set up and doesn't have liaisons for folks who see things from below. It doesn't have liaisons to help people navigate that system. He leaves and says, you know what? When the lease is over, I will leave. Let's just leave it like that. When the lease is over, I'll leave. We'll part ways. Nothing's wrong. He still leaves with $628 fees that he can't pay. So how is it possible that the two charges that were brought against him no longer hold, and yet for the experience, he owes $628? This is what I'm talking about when we say that if you don't do anything wrong, you don't have any worry. You don't have any fear to be evicted, any fear to have fees, any fear to be taken to court, any fear of a sheriff coming and forcing you to take your things out, right? That's not the case. That's not the case in that situation. $628 for most of us is a lot, especially when you didn't do anything. That's not just. And that happened, that's our own court system that we elect in Delaware County. We elected that judge that did that permits that. We elect the people that do that system. And it's not right. It's not fair. And so, you need your pastor, you need to hear your pastor say that not all courts practice justice. Not all judges are right. that the U.S. often finds ways of criminalizing the activities of the poor and the activities of minorities. Let me give you a couple examples from our own history, and we're going to use drugs. Is that all right? I mean, we're not going to use drugs. We're going to use drugs as an example. Somewhere back in here, I'm wondering if I did that on purpose.
Oh my gosh.
Oh boy. We're not using drugs. We're going to talk about drugs. Here we go. Ready? So you are familiar that in in the Southwest and into the area that's now called Mexico, traditionally over hundreds of years, that has been a place that has used the plant marijuana. Are you familiar with this? Can I get some head nods? Yeah. Okay. So a couple hundred years ago, people were using the marijuana plant for medicine. They were also using the marijuana plant for intoxication. Let's just be real. They were. Okay. So it's not a criminal thing. In the 1800s, it's not a criminal thing. People use it. People also have different kinds of varieties of this plant, and some of them were one time a cash crop because you could use the fibers of this plant for making ropes that went on big ships. They were trustworthy ropes that you could use, and this type of stuff, like commercial and industrial use of the fibers of this plant. Yeah. Yes, correct. Folks call that hemp. Well, it is going along, whether or not whether or not the churches in that time felt like people should be intoxicated by it or not. Some folks say, well, using it in a tea is a little different than drinking alcohol. Whatever those arguments are, whatever truth they have, don't have, forget about all that debate and all that discussion. I want to let you know that it became criminal. I'm not advocating for marijuana, okay? I'm telling a story. Don't hear what I'm not saying. It became criminal to possess, to smoke, to give, to sell. And here's when it became criminal. When there became a conflict with Mexicans moving into what were called the U.S., the United States or America, in about 1910. So when another group who speaks Spanish doesn't speak English, when a group who might see the world in comparison to the States might see the world as people who are looking up, both literally and figuratively, to the north, to see how their policies determine the lives of everyone around them. And it wasn't criminal until Mexicans started moving into the territories and the states of the U.S. And then folks said, oh my goodness, look at the vagrants, look at all the damage, look at all the violence, look at all the bloodshed, look at all the theft that these Mexicans are doing, and they're using marijuana. Here, if we outlaw marijuana, make it criminal, because it's a common cultural item in that culture at that time. If we make that criminal, then we can start to lock up Mexicans. Right? You see how what starts out or attempts to be justice, or what we hope is justice in criminal justice. Here's another experience that how many people of a variety of ethnicities are locked up for this thing that the dominant culture made criminal because they got concerned and their feathers were ruffled by a Spanish-speaking group coming into the territories. And they found something that they could identify to put them in jail and to put them in prison. Whether or not you think, no matter what you think about marijuana, that action is unjust. To pick something of someone's culture to criminalize it so that you can then control their bodies through policing, prison, and jail, and put fines on them, Like, that is unjust. And then today, we see lots of people, and you actually spend so much money in taxes to put people in jail and prison who are not dangerous, who smoke every once in a while, who somehow got caught or targeted, and now they're not working. Now they're not providing for their families. Now they're not with their kids. Look at the sinful repercussions of that action from around 1910. It's terrible. I'm going to use the same pattern to tell another story. So, in the 1800s, when the railroad was being built from the East Coast to the West Coast, all this kind of expansion, opium and morphine and things made from that, those types of plants, was in every doctor's handbag. You remember, kind of in the landscape of history, you remember you used to call the doctor, and the doctor would come to your home. You might have a black or a brown bag, or a big wooden box that has all these compartments that open, little hidden compartments, slides, but all made out of wood, and it would have everything that someone would need to treat most things when they visit a sick person in the home. Okay, and one of those things that they used for a variety of things was opium and morphine. Well, let me tell you that that's addictive. It's highly addictive. We all know that, right? That's why if we have surgery and we use pain pills to recover, that we want to have somebody monitor us, and we want to quit taking them as soon as possible, so that we don't develop a habit. And that really applies to everybody. Okay, in the 1800s, the majority of people that had a dependency on opium or morphine were middle-class, older white women. It was just standard practice for ailments to supply middle-class, older white women with opium or morphine. And they would have a little clear or brown bottle with a cork in it, and they could dose when they needed to or wanted to. And they became dependent. Okay, it was not a crime. It was not a crime for the doctor to dispense that or carry that. It was not a crime for 60% of the dependent folks to be dependent on opium. I mean, 60% were the older class white women. Of all people who were dependent, 60% of them was that group. Not a crime. In fact, we called it habit forming. We called them being dependent on a substance. And it in some places, maybe some churches, maybe some families, maybe some clubs, someone who was dependent, it was a scandal, right? Especially because if they used too much at one time and went to a function or an event, everyone would know. It was sort of a scandalous thing. It was something that people would talk about behind their backs. It had social consequences, but it was not criminal. Let me tell you, when our criminal justice system, our legal system, criminalized morphine, opium, the production of it, the carrying of it, the using it, the passing it out, they criminalized it when the railroad companies brought in a large amount of people from China, large amount of people from Asia, in order to work on laying railroads. They worked in camps that went along, and they lived in tents or these wood shanties that could be easily put up and taken down. And they worked to install railroads throughout the West. And they terminated on the West Coast, right? And then we have large, lots of places in the West Coast. They have sections of the town that's called Chinatown, right? You go to San Francisco, well, you can go to Chinatown, right? Okay, so it terminates there. When those folks who were brought here from China to labor, when they started becoming a part of the culture here in the States and in the territories, then folks got the idea that they were a threat. Then folks got the idea that they speak a different language. Then folks got the idea that we don't really want them here. We wanted their labor, but as soon as they buy a house and live next door, we don't want it. And so, what is a way to control the bodies, the money, the spirits, the families of these Chinese folks? You know what? I've noticed that they actually use more opium or have more opium. It's more part of their culture than even the white folks in the States. Isn't it about time that we do something about that? I mean, opium's terrible, isn't it? Morphine's terrible. Look at the rage and the destruction that opium is causing. And now we'll criminalize it. It's illegal. And if you break the law, you will be punished. You'll have fines and fees. You're going to spend some time in jail. We can use sheriffs and police to come and raid your Chinatown areas, your blocks, your neighborhoods, the places that you live, the shanty towns that you have put up. We will now invade those places because we have just cause that you have a criminal item, opium or morphine. And so then it becomes illegal. We went from folks that were scandalized and dependent upon a substance to criminals. But let me ask you, when that transition took place, did the majority of users, did older white middle-class women go to jail? Of course not. Of course, they're just dependent. The rules don't apply to them. And so we see that the unit, if we treated the United States and the territories as a congregation, the congregation was attacking one particular group because they were threatened that they weren't like them. They were different. The states and territories live up here, and those that they don't want to interfere with life up here or change life up here, those they don't want to gain too much power, too much land, too much money, well, we'll find an item that will make criminal to make them stay down here. And Jesus says that when you visit someone in prison, when you correspond with them, when you do a video conference now because you can't go in and meet, you are speaking as if it was to Jesus. And so those folks that were locked up for drugs, which I'm not talking about drugs, am I? I mean, actually, that's not really what we're talking about, is it? Like, we're not talking about marijuana or opium or morphine. We're talking about picking an item that we find distasteful or that we can make a cause for in someone's culture in order to control them. And Jesus says those folks, and that's not unique to here. Like, if anybody can criminalize something about a group that they don't want to interfere with their lives around the world, they'll do it. It's not just what we do. People do that. They do it in different ways. And Jesus is saying that the folks who are in prison, he identifies with. Their bodies are behind bars. And so we see in the crucifixion that his own body moves behind bars with them. When they are locked up, when they are fined $628 for doing nothing, Jesus, through his death, through the crucifixion, he identifies with their debt. He identifies with their imprisonment. Jesus puts himself in the position of the least of these. He is someone who sees the homeless and in the homeless body that doesn't get regular medical care, that doesn't get regular nutrition, that doesn't get regular dental care, that doesn't get regular vision care, that doesn't get regular shelter. He, through the crucifixion, identifies with those bodies that the group up here has kept down here. And so that is why we can walk in and see an image of Jesus sticking his hand out through the bars. We see the nail, the scar hole, and we can say that there is no stigma for those who have been to jail in the church. In the church, there is no stigma for those who have been imprisoned. In the church, there is no stigma for those who have been fined. And I'm even going to take it to the next level. There is no stigma even if it was just. Even if you did something wrong and that wrong thing should have been criminalized and you had the consequences for it, there is no stigma here at Avondale. Those who have been in prison or in prison, and those who have never been in prison, those who have never dealt with court system, because Jesus is our peace between all the barriers between humans, because Jesus is that reconciliation, the people behind bars and the people outside of bars, in the congregation, in the church, we are the same. And the way that we are the same is because that Jesus identified from those who look up. His body was broken for those whose bodies are controlled. And he says, I move into the place of the jail, and you come visit me, because this is where I'll be. I will be with those who are in prison. I will be where there are people who are homeless. I will be in the group that needs food. I will be in the group that needs health care. I will be in the group that doesn't have shelter. I will be in the group who have to migrate because they own no land, and no one will help them or give them or provide space for their families and for their bodies in the land. I will be in those groups. And so when you see prison and jail, it doesn't matter if it's just or unjust. I gave you examples of unjust today. It doesn't matter if it's just or unjust. There is no stigma. So change your thinking, right? Change your thinking about those who have been in jail, because that's where Jesus is. If you see folks that are in need, migrants that come through the borders looking for anything that resembles life, anything that resembles safety, remember that it would be Jesus who would be in that group coming with them. Or when we see refugees that are being evacuated from different parts of the world, and we wonder, where are they going to go? How are they going to fit in? Well, at least the church can have a voice, and the church can have a witness that it would be Jesus in that group if he were here today. We'd be evacuating Mary, Joseph, and Jesus from Afghanistan. We'd be evacuating Mary, Joseph, and Jesus from Syria. When we went to find people to talk with and give water to at the border because they just crossed the desert, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus would be right there. And when you have that perspective, you begin to see the world actually through the eyes of Jesus. And how the crucifixion, that horrible, bloody, disgusting, unjust death, takes on all of the bloody, disgusting, unjust death in the world. And his body, resurrected, makes a promise that the bloody, disgusting, unjust death in the world is not the end. Jesus becomes the first to see the world from below, to get bulldozed by the world from above and to rise from the dead, saying, I will save all of the people from below, and I will save the people from above from themselves. This is the Christ. When we pray the Lord's Prayer, we really mean, give us this day our daily bread. We got nothing else. That's it. If you have no other prayer, pray that one. And so you need to hear your pastor say that there is no stigma if you've been to prison, jail. There is no stigma with Jesus. The stigma that is just or unjust does no longer matter because Christ takes his body into the homeless shelters, into the prisons, into the food lines, across the borders, jumping onto planes. That is Jesus' crucified body. And our response is to change our minds and visit. Do not leave the poor. The prayer of the church in Acts, do all these other things, but please do not forget. Please make sure to remember the poor. I'm not identifying the poor. I'm saying in whatever social context you live in, that we live in, society has the least. And if you move across the world, it'll be a little bit different, but society will still do the same thing. And that is where Jesus is. And so go and visit and encourage and teach and love. Go help people find and make systems whereby they can create or buy or receive food. Go into places that need housing and figure out how to do safe and affordable housing because it's for Jesus. The folks that we used to call dependent, when it was criminalized, it's now addicts. Let's get rid of the stigma of that word, addict, addiction. Some of us in here, we are not addicted or dependent upon drugs, but we're sure dependent and addicted to other things, right? Identify your own proclivity towards dependency on things. Identify with others who maybe do not have the stamina or the will or the experience or the support or the resources that some of us have. See Jesus in their bodies, in their eyes, and take care of them with love and compassion and grace and mercy as if it was the King standing there himself. Brother Jimmy.